You're listening to A Window on the East, an IntelliNews podcast.
So, welcome everyone to another edition of Window on the East. Me, Ben Harris, the editor of BNE IntelliNews. I'm joined by an old friend, Chris Weafer. We go way back to Moscow days. Although he runs Macro Advisory, which is a geopolitical macroeconomic consultancy. He's worked for pretty much all the investment banks, the former advisor to OPEC. Is really steeped in this whole story. And I thought we haven't done this for a while, so it's time to have a catch up and look at the state of play, starting with what's going on in Ukraine, and then broadening out to the broader shift that the Chinese and the Russians are trying to build this geopolitical alternative, what they call the multipolar world order, and how that's going. So, Chris, really good to see you again.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for the invitation.
And let's dive in. I mean, you actually are living with one foot in Moscow. You're in and out.
Yes.
That's cool. Recently, there's been lots of talk about the economy is quote unquote in crisis. And clearly it's under pressure. I mean, obviously the inflation rates are so high that they've driven up the overnight rates to, intolerable levels. And there's talk of oligarchs running out of money, and 3 out of every 4 rubles earned by Russian companies are going to debt service, and it's killing investment. And so these are problems. And Nabulina, the governor of the central bank, is working on it. Inflation is starting to come down now. But you live there. Is it actually in crisis? Do you see it on the street?
No, you don't. There is certainly no evidence of any crisis in the economy or in people's kind of living conditions. And I've lived through plenty of economic downturns in Europe and in Asia through my career. And this doesn't feel like it. There's no sense of crisis in Moscow. The shop shelves are pretty much as fully stacked as they were. There was a period in 2022 when there were certainly empty shelves, but that was corrected by late 22, early 23, and remains the case. And also people are not talking about economic crisis. They're not talking about economic concerns, which would, typically normally be the case when there is a downturn. And I would have to say that, life continues as normal. You do have occasional kind of aberrations or outliers as well. And these get picked up a lot in international media as examples of the economy in crisis. For example, 2 years ago, there was a spike in the price of eggs, which led to headlines about the economy in crisis. Then last year there was a headlines about the price of butter, and this silly story about butter being put under kind of armed guard, kind of almost, again being used as an example of crisis. There are aberrations and there are shortages, but in general, no, it's not the case. And of course the reason for that is because, first of all, Russia does have a long-term problem of declining demographics, of declining workforce, but today and for the last couple of years, it meant that there's pretty much been full employment in the country. Wages have been going up, of course, too fast, but they have been going up by about 20%.
And they've been running ahead of the inflation. I mean, people are saying, inflation is 10%, but 10%, yeah. Wages are going up like 12%, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. So, people have had plenty of money to spend, and that's still the case. So even now, as we see the action by the central bank and by the government generally to try and cool down that pace of economy, it's still not affecting kind of, people in Russia. And so there is the discussion about...
Can I ask you, isn't this a case of bread and circuses, in so much as Putin's gone out of his way to shield the public from any effects of the war? And Sobyanin, the mayor of Moscow, just launched yesterday 3 months of festivals in Moscow, and they've done up the whole city, and there's apparently
we've had this for the last few years. It's called the Summer in Moscow Festival, and for example, there's a big park outside where I live in Moscow on Chisty Boulevard, and they've been preparing for this for the last 6 to 7 months of various theaters and stalls and sorts of. We've had it for the last couple of years. So, yeah, it is tempting to portray it as, give them circuses rather than the economy, but that implies that the economy is on the brink of collapse, and that really isn't the case. And the economy is the structure is wrong in that the drivers of growth have been military-industrial complex spending and high consumer activity on the back of high wages. Now the government has taken the decision to cool both of those. We're seeing a policy of fiscal prudence, which they're trying to manage, and it is a little bit like trying to steer a boat back into harbour through choppy waters. There's always a danger of hitting the rocks, but they have decided that there will be a period of fiscal prudence, and the central bank, of course, since last September with the high interest policy, has been trying to cool the economy, and both the government and the central bank have been maintaining the same line, which is that the growth rate of whereas we
inflation's already fallen from 10%.
Yeah, it's
9.4.
they have. It is a little bit of taking the extreme measures in order to cure the patient, or in this case, maybe to prevent the patient from getting worse or getting sicker. So they have, the 21% high interest policy, which, as you say, in the introduction, has led to huge complaints from business and a decline in investment, but the central bank persuaded the president that this was the necessary extreme action in order to cool what was an overheated economy. And do bear in mind, when people talk about the decline in the economy right now, the context is important, and the context is that you've almost had 4% growth in each of the last couple of years for reasons that were unsustainable. So the economy is cooling down to half that rate, but it's still going to be about 2 to 2.5% this year, which is pretty good on a global scale. Now, the central bank basically said last year that if they didn't take this action with a high interest rate and focus on inflation, but also mainly, looking to cool down what they described as overheated consumer spending in areas like auto sales, which were at a record last year, and other discretionary spending, then that could lead to a bigger crisis later. So this is very much a deliberate government action, which so far appears to be working. Now, as we heard at SPIEF in St. Petersburg recently from the economy ministry and the finance ministry and the central bank, there is, of course, the danger of excessive intervention, which could lead to kind of overcooling, etc. So yeah, it is a delicate balancing act they're involved in. But what you can say, the bottom line is that there is no evidence of any major economic strains in kind of like in daily life in Russia, certainly in key industries, planes, etc. But daily life and it really doesn't feel the same way as an economic downturn or crisis as we've experienced over the last number of decades.
To what extent does Putin have Nabiulina's back? Because you mentioned SPIEF and closely watched the economic session there where you had Nabiulina and Zelyanov, and there was talk of recession from the economics minister, and Shokin, the chair of the RSPP, the oligarchs or big industry lobby group. They're up in arms. They're putting lots of pressure on Nabiulina to cut. And she made this 1% cut, which was symbolic, but, that wasn't expected, that cut. And it looked like she was caving a bit. But, there is a rebellion or a huge argument going on. And Putin, as far as I can see, he trusts Nabiulina and he's letting her do her stuff.
Yeah, no, 100%. And look, and just as an aside, it is interesting that there was so much public discussion about the dangers in the economy, the risks of recession, the decline, the dangers of getting the strategy wrong. So public at SPIEF. And SPIEF, you would normally expect to be the venue where, President Putin, the Kremlin, wants to talk everything up, wants to portray as positive a story as possible, tell everybody that everything is great. But there was a lot of discussion about the problems. the risks of the economy and the problems that the country faces kind of post-conflict and the recovery phase, which is, for me, it's encouraging that is so public and such a big venue. And it does suggest that the Kremlin is now starting to worry more about the economy and is looking to deal with these rather than brush them under the carpet, which, again, I think is positive in terms of the assumptions as to what Russia's position when it comes to peace talks might be. Because as Bill Clinton famously said, the economy does matter. But on your question, yeah, there is no doubt that President Putin does give full support to the central bank. And Governor Nabulina has not really put many steps or feet wrong, as it were, over the last few years. She's managed to restructure the banking sector. She's weeded out what were clearly bad banking practices. She's prevented any major banking crisis, over the last decade or so. And her high rate policy, which she certainly needed Putin's full support in the face of this opposition, is working into that. We now see inflation has peaked, and also this runaway consumer economy where people were borrowing like 100% growth rate in auto loans to buy cars and areas like that. That has also cooled, which is very positive in terms of economic stability. So she certainly is one of the stars. But in general, one of the reasons why I always tell people what Russia has survived sanctions so relatively well is because the country has a very, very strong economic management team. That management team has the full support of the president because it is very important when it comes to talk about Putin. He certainly focuses on security, of course, as we clearly know, but he is very concerned about economic stability because stability is the bedrock of his public support.
This is going to be painful. The analogy I like is what's going on is like, Bullen is flying the plane and the throttle is stuck on full military spending and she can't touch that. She won't be allowed to reduce that.
Well, yes and no. There has been
what she's attempting to do in order to land the economy is bring it down without putting the landing gear down. So she's crushing what bits of growth she can, what bits of credit she can. And so there's clearly going to be damage done to Russia in the process.
I think that's very clear. And you're absolutely right. Well, I was conscious always to make sure when we're talking about a positive story, you're absolutely right to highlight the negatives as well. The negatives are building. And we mentioned the demographic decline, which to some extent is actually, saving the economy because even if the economy is a hard landing and now is cooling down, you do not have, the normally associated high unemployment or people losing their jobs. Unemployment rate is about 2%. And with the government's kind of stricter control over migrant workers from Central Asia, the problem that Russia has is a shortage of workers. So you're not going to have that side of a problem. You're not going to have social problems, which are normally associated. And therefore, you probably won't have domestic political problems. But there's no doubt that the economic side, the longer this conflict goes on, then the greater these problems will be and the more difficult they will be to deal with. And we're starting to hear that also from people like First Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov, whose role appears to be how to address localization and economic recovery and attracting key industries post-conflict, because there is a lot of discussion about the problems that Russia is facing and will have to face the longer this conflict goes on. As I'd like to paraphrase Churchill's famous phrase, but in the case in Russia, is a country that usually does the right thing when there's absolutely no other choice. And it's in a lot of these areas where these problems, for example, demographics, the lack of technology or equipment base at home, these are problems that have been massively exposed because of sanctions, and they will have to be dealt with. And I think they will be dealt with, but it won't be quick. It'll be certainly a long time.
So it's fair that, the thing is this landing that she's trying to do without the landing gear, which will stop the plane. Get it down. But there's a possibility of a complete plane wreck here. However, I think you probably agree with me that we have a lot of confidence in Nabulana's skills and that she's going to do it with the minimum damage because she's proved herself to be such a good pilot.
Yeah, and it's not just her. Remember, it's, the finance minister Siluanov and Reshnikov in the economy ministry. I mean, there's a team of people that have shown very strong competence. And the important thing to bear in mind, despite President Putin's reputation globally, is he does seem to understand at least the basics of the economy. And what he clearly understands is that an economy that's in trouble will lose him public support, and that completely undermines his position. So if, for example, he gave the support for the high interest rate because inflation appears to be one of those issues that keeps him awake at night. I remember working for an oligarch many, many years ago on the banks, and he would always preach that. He said President Putin has a fear of bank failures and inflation because he's lived through both, and he knows that's what will destroy the political system. So he at least understands the basics and gives them strong support to try and avoid those problems. But when the plane lands and you assess the wreckage, there's clearly going to be a lot of work needed to be done to repair, and that's a different story.
To switch tack slightly, I mean, you mentioned that the fundamental problem here is military spending, and the war going on is the cause of all these problems, and a solution would be to stop it. So news was out this morning or from last night, I think. Trump definitively said no more Patriots, no more air defense for Ukraine. And that's basically thrown Ukraine under the bus. Zelensky's been running around trying to get more defense. There was a barrage started in May, and the same as what happened last year when they ran out of air defense missiles. The skies were open. Russia immediately destroyed the entire non-nuclear generating capacity. And here we are again, they just shot down an F-16, and that was up there because it was trying to shoot down missiles because they didn't have enough Patriots anymore. And there aren't any. The Americans running out, the European have used up their stocks. And Gideon Rachman, the lead writer of the FT, came out with a very dark op-ed saying that basically this war could be over in 6 months. We've been skeptical from the beginning, from the end of the first year, but it seems to be public, that the mainstream press are also looking at this is not a good situation. Without that defense, do you think Ukraine, they're going to lose this war? People are actually talking about that behind closed doors.
Well, I think my impression here is, first of all, I think the reason the US has woken up to the fact that it cannot be everywhere, active everywhere at the same time. It's the biggest military and economy in the world. There are still restraints, especially in an age where technology and sophisticated weapons like Patriot, etc., matter more than, say, numbers of troops. And what we hear, that the first wake up call, or the first kind of message from the Pentagon to the White House about this came actually when with the conflict between India and Pakistan. The US was blindsided on that, and two nuclear powers. I think that was a big wake-up call. And then, of course, the continuing supply to Israel, which, of course, is by far the greatest priority for any government in the US to support Israel, and now with Iran. So I think that it seems as if the powers that be, i.e. the military and others in Washington, have simply accepted the fact that they cannot continue to give the same level of support to Ukraine and fulfill what they see as their obligations in the Middle East and elsewhere. So they need an end to this. My view...
No, and we tried, Trump pushed really hard from February to get the ceasefire, and then Zelensky dug his heels in and said, no giving away sovereignty. So Trump was basically echoing Putin's points, and that was one of the major ones. But does this mean that they've walked away completely?
No, I think they've walked away for a while, it seems. And Trump did say that. His analogy of the schoolyard, sometimes you're better off to let them fight it out and then come in later. And it seems as if, how would I say, it seems as if Trump has decided to take a break from Russia, Ukraine. And I guess that means that he's letting Russia get on with it, maybe through the summer, certainly with less equipment being supplied to Kyiv in the next couple of months, and Russia engaged in a summer offensive, then Russia's position should certainly be stronger by the end of the summer. But as we said earlier, the Russian economy will not be stronger, will probably be a bit weaker, with a big budget deficit of 1.5% at the end of April. And there's only about $36 billion of liquid assets left in the National Fund. Russia's economy will start to look weaker in terms of ability to fund the war coming up towards the end of the year. And I think that's the basis of my view of what happens, is that Russia's economy will start to, in terms of resources, to continue the war and to maintain economic stability, will become more under strain as we move into the autumn. Ukraine's military position looks set to deteriorate, and I think that's when Trump, perhaps we expect the US to come back in with this mixture of threats and incentives. And then what we hear in Washington is that when he comes back with that mixture of threats and incentives, in other words, more and tougher sanctions, or sanctions easing in the case of Russia, then there'll probably be more of a receptive audience in Moscow than has been the case. So again, it's always easy to remain completely gloomy with no end, and it's to look for a solution. But
it's depressing, isn't it? And I mean, the Russians now have, like, if the skies are open, they can just pound it with missiles, which they're doing now. The barrages we've had now are the biggest ever. But against that, the Ukrainians have very successfully built up their drone industry.
Yes.
And they're producing half their own drones, and they're talking about 2.5 million, up from 1.5 last year. And what that does is effectively make it impossible to move in infantry on the battlefield.
Yes.
So it means you get a stalemate. It's like trench warfare, that the Russians can pound and then bring in reinforcements, but without the mechanization, as soon as they step into no man's land, they get killed by drones. And it's just going to. So I guess Zelensky's game plan here must be just to drag it out as long as it can and wait for the Russians.
It looks like, and the analogy, I guess, would be First World War, where there was no kind of battlefield solution, and eventually you had to agree a deal. Obviously, maybe different, of course, in this case, that there, it's that there are important differences. But in terms of the military and battlefields, and clearly becoming evident that there's no military solution to this, I think that's now obvious to everybody. And but I do believe that this combination of Russia's kind of financial resources depleting, and the US kind of withdrawing support for Ukraine, that those two factors are going to be decisive when we come into the autumn. And also, one very good book covers a lot of this that I just read recently, called the Eurasian Century, which talks about the role of the Eurasia region in this kind of long-term conflict between the US and China. And you read that and you think, yeah, okay, this is one reason why the US does not want Russia to lose. It doesn't want Russia to win decisively and maybe then be seen as a threat to Western Europe going forward, but really wants this to end kind of more or less where it is, but on good terms with Russia, because the danger, according, as set out clearly in this book, is that if Russia is defeated, then it has nowhere to go except to China, and that greatly strengthens China's position in terms of access to materials and industrial materials, and effectively it would have a border with the European Union, and the US doesn't want that either. So, there's a lot of moving parts here.
So if we assume Trump is out for the meantime, this drops the whole problem into the EU's lap.
Yes.
And we just had the NATO summit and this promise of 5% of GDP. And they're talking a big talk about, building joint factories, the Danish model, in Ukraine to help it, like, rather than supply it with weapons so it can make its own weapons. But I've been having a look at the economies. Germany's about the only one that's in the position to spend this money, simply because it has, modest 67% of GDP. And the EU promise of this 150, later 800 billion euros. But these are all debt instruments. As it seems to me, the Spanish came out and said, and Fico in Slovakia too, we're not going to spend that on defense. We need to build hospitals and education and what have you. So to what extent is this realistic that Europe can actually take up the mantle? Because, even with the Welsh summit, when they promised 2%, a third of the countries are still not even at 2%, let alone going up to 5%.
No, I think this is kind of short term kind of expediency. It's easier just to show solidarity to make these kind of promises. But like all political promises, and sorry, don't mean to be excessively cynical about politicians, but we all know political promises are put out there, to make the politicians look, or political parties look good, and then they always revert to reality, and make changes and make excuses. So I would say, yeah, it's probably the unusual factor that we've had is that the Spanish have been honest about it. But you would expect most countries to say, yeah, of course we will, and 5 years later you see that they haven't done it because
We should say at this point that there's no enforcement mechanism.
No, of course there is.
There's no way of pressuring, anyone.
Yeah, look, look, as far as I can see, pretty much everybody, but in terms of like leadership in Europe and leadership in Europe and other countries is that they've got a clock on their wall, which is counting down probably to the midterm elections next year in the US. In the hope that the Republicans suffer some significant setback in those elections, and then they can forget about Trump for the following 2 years, and then hope there's a new government that behaves in the way that other governments and administrations in the U.S. did. So it seems to me that there is an awful lot of we've got to survive the next 12 months. Kind of play the game, not try and cause any major rifts. And in 12 months' time, or the midterm elections in November next year, we'll be able to breathe again and kind of get back to normal. I think that's the game.
Can I ask specifically, because in the meantime, Europe's on the hook to fund Ukraine to the tune of whatever it is, $40 billion euros a year.
Yes.
And some of that money is coming from the ERA, the frozen central bank funds profits. But specifically, all of the big players, the UK, France, Italy, they're all with 100% of GDP debt.
Yes.
And they're already in budget crisis. France in particular is an extremely nasty budget crisis. And this spending of these billions of dollars, Tim Ash, Bluebird, is talking about 100 billion a year, the actual cost of the war. And the Ukraine is looking to the West to help it, get through this. It's got money for this year. But surely by next year, it's going to run out of money. The EU hasn't got money. How bad, how much pressure are these big European countries on?
Well, as you say, that they're under a lot of pressure, and you just have to look at the news almost from any country, including my own home country, Ireland, which is small, but still has exactly the same problems of people protesting because of lack of adequate housing, the lack, reductions in social care. The same thing in the UK government did this week. So governments are under pressure, but so long as there are TV pictures of apartment blocks in Kyiv and elsewhere being bombed and people being killed, then people will not object to funding from. They'll grumble, I guess, to put it down. They'll complain, but they won't really protest. But as soon as there's a ceasefire and as soon as the war ends, I think that's when the attitude and public attitude will change. Because we know Ukraine, of course, will want to, and is hoping and is planning, I guess, to continue receiving very significant amount of European financial support for the rebuilding phase. But I think public tolerance for that rebuilding phase will be significantly less than public support for Ukraine in the midst of it is. That's when the trouble will be.
Nobody's promised anything towards the rebuild.
No, but Ukraine is expecting it. The countries are talking about it. That as you quite rightly say, there's no specific commitments, but there is the assumption in Ukraine that the West, the EU in particular, will provide significant resources to rebuild the economy. And even the question of refugees, again, you see it in a lot of the media and reporting. There is an assumption that the supporting Ukrainian refugees is expensive for all countries. There is an assumption that they will all go home as soon as there's a peace deal and that funding will stop. But what happens if they don't want to and they want to stay where they are and they want to continue? There's a lot of these kind of social political issues are there in the wings. and the next phase will be triggered with the peace. It for good reason. It's often said that winning the peace can be more difficult than winning the war.
I'm actually very pessimistic about that. I mean, they had the reconstruction conferences, and 2 years ago they floated the idea the private sector will pay for it. But you look at the numbers, the World Bank's talking 526 billion of damage. The IFIs have commitments to the tune of 75 billion. So there's a huge gap between the two. And the managers, the fund managers I've talked to, who are all emerging market Eastern Europe veterans, they were like, yeah, the story's fantastic, but I'm going to wait at least 3-4 years because there's the threat of a second invasion, and property rights are still not down. The judiciary in Ukraine is completely dysfunctional. You go to Moscow and you have the arbitration court, which works. You have contracts that more or less work, and all of that is missing in Ukraine. And
we hear the same thing from, we deal mainly with corporations, multinationals in different sectors, and it is pretty much the same story there. Obviously there are some exceptions, again, to say on the Irish side, Kingspan, an Irish company, is building a big factory, but they're involved in construction, so they'll be kind of first wave in the infrastructure rebuilding, repairing roads, etc. But other industries, it's exactly the same attitude, is that we'll take our time, we'll wait to see how it goes. In other words, the majority of companies will wait to see the recovery process starting and working, and then they'll jump on and it will accelerate. But it could be the first couple of years could be extremely difficult in attracting investment and investors. And
I thought it was interesting. Having been a veteran of Moscow in the beginning of the 90s, the first people in are always the FMCGs, fast-moving consumer goods.
yes,
And we've already got a beer factory, Carlsberg, and a cigarette factory, Philip Morris, already built. And those guys, but then they have like a lot of money, and they're basically looking, 30, 40 years down the road, and they're market share. It's not going to be enough to prime the pump. And that cash has got to come from somewhere.
Yeah, and also there is, again, but it's just realistic that there will be political changes in Kyiv. There will be a lot of political upheaval. We know there's a lot of unresolved issues. And investors will, look, I always say there are two critical factors that you need to be evident in any emerging market to attract money. One is economic predictability, and the other is political stability. If you have both of those, you're going to attract a lot of money. If you lose one or if you lose both, forget it. The case of Kyiv, they are without either at this stage. Now, arguably, Russia is certainly without the economic predictability. This side of things, again, as a lot of countries are, but Ukraine, on the day the war ends, will have major question marks over economic predictability and political stability, and they'll need to address both of those before investors come back.
Just as a niche question here, so we just said that the capital to do the rebuild, we're not sure where it's going to come from. It's going to be very difficult to get enough. The other problem is the demographics. And we've got, whatever it is, 6 to 8 million people out of the country. But they're all women. It's all the women that's gone. I was out last night with a Ukrainian refugee. She's 22. She's studying architecture. And I'm like, are you going to go home? And she's like, well, my mum went back because she misses home, but I'm staying here. And I think numbers now down to 20% of the people on the outside. Moreover, you've got people like the Poles and the Germans. They're actually keen to hang on to these.
Yes,
they need labor.
Yeah, no, I think it's to be an issue. Yeah,
the demographics collapsing. The UN's talking about population falling to 25 million. 25 million.
Well, it's possible. I mean, it's a lot of guesswork at this stage, but you're right. The assumptions that any assumption that the population will quickly recover and you can base your activity and your numbers off that are simply wrong. Now, as to what the right numbers will be and how long it'll take to get there, it is completely unknown at this stage. But you're right. We all know these stories. Again, to say, go back to a small town in the middle of Ireland, we know that there are a lot of Ukrainian people, again, they say women and kids, but they're setting down roots. And I saw my brother a couple of days ago, and he was talking to one family like that, and then she told him that her husband will join her as soon as he's able to. It's not a case of, well, she'll go back and join him and rebuild. It's like, no, he's coming. So yeah, there's an enormous question mark over what will be the workforce demographic, and it's just one of many uncertainties, all of which, as you say, if you're a multinational company or if you're an emerging market investor, it leads you to the same conclusion: is wait to see how it pans out. And I think that's what will happen. There will not be a rush to the door, except for companies like Kingspan or others that are going to be involved in infrastructure rebuilding.
Yeah. To broaden things out, so the sanctions regime has been extreme. I think 30,000 altogether on Russia, and it didn't work. Like you said, Russia's been growing at 4%, which actually makes it from the major economies one of the fastest, strongest growing countries. And what Putin had done is they were already friendly with China. And everyone in the beginning was saying, oh, Russia's going to be a raw materials warehouse appendage to China. But that's not happened. And so much as, Xi and Putin are aligned, because what they see, what maybe Putin successfully sold to Xi Jinping, is that, we're under attack by NATO, the West, they're bullying us, they're using their weapons, and that we, the global South, need to unite. Because we're second-class citizens in the global scheme of things. You've got America and Europe, and they're sanctioning people and dictating to us and saying, oh, you have to have gay pride, you have to have gay marriage laws, and we don't want to do that, and they sanction us when we don't. And yet, America's gun control laws are out of control, and nobody in Europe ever criticizes. So they're saying there's a double standard here, and it's actually going quite well. For me, the standout was Indonesia, which was talking about becoming a BRIC 2 years ago, but then dithered, sat on the fence, wanted to see how things had gone. And then they're the latest edition, having joined in January. And at the NATO, the G7 summit just gone, the predecessor president went to the G7 meeting, and this time the president skipped it and was guest of honor at SPIF. And Indonesia is the fourth biggest country in the world. And so this whole global South thing is going well. And this was all shown into sharp relief by the recent hostilities in the Gulf. And there's another direction where Putin and Xi Jinping are making big inroads in the Middle East. They're also rife throughout Africa. And specifically with the Gulf, Iran has been sort of ostracized, and Putin hasn't been able to help Tehran directly. But I think part of the reason he was holding back to some extent is that he's still holding out for a deal with Trump, or Trump brokered deal. And so he couldn't reverse the flow of the drones and start sending them from Russian factories back to Tehran to drop on Israel. But it's very complicated. How do you, that time in the Middle East, how do you see that whole relationship?
Yeah, no, I just say complicated, of course, is an understatement when it comes to the Middle East. But we've been tracking, say, the Kremlin's exchanges with the White House, with the European leaders, with Gulf leaders, with Netanyahu, and with the Iranians. So there, in terms of the officially announced communication, so Putin has been talking a lot to all these people many, many times over the last couple of weeks. And the way we describe it is not so much as an intermediary as a go-between, in the sense that, he can talk to everybody on the circuit and relay messages and perhaps be involved in somehow or other broking a deal, but rather than intermediary. And that appears to have worked. And I think you're right. Perhaps that's one reason why President Trump has backed off criticism of Russia, appears to be going easy on Russia, is because the Kremlin has had a role in maybe tempering the reaction of Iran, of maybe cooling the potential escalation in Iran. For example, we do know that that Russia had a role in kind of arranging the Iranian kind of missile strike in Qatar. It was kind of arranged for 3:00 in the afternoon, it'll fly this way and it'll hit this sand dune. And then that was all prearranged. We now know that with the available evidence. And then the other important thing is that the agreement that Russia has with Iran, it's purely trade and investment cooperation. There is no provision whatsoever for any military support. Yes, Iran has been sending drones to Russia, but Russia is now largely producing those drones domestically using Ukrainian designs.
There was a technology swap, wasn't there?
Yeah, the technology swap, but there's no provision for Russia to intervene on behalf of Iran or vice versa in the event of a military.
Interestingly, there is a security agreement, an Article 5 type arrangement with North Korea, and specifically this strategic relationship they signed in January with Tehran was trade and investments.
Yes, trade investment. Again, aligned with the fact that Iran has a free trade agreement with Eurasia Economic Union, which by default means it's got a free trade agreement with all of the Central Asian states and some others. And also Iran, as of January, is a full member of BRICS. So the agreement that Russia has with Iran is aligned with that kind of BRICS membership, EAAU, and but nothing more. I mean, frankly, it would be downright crazy for any country to do a defense cooperation agreement with almost any country in the Middle East, because you never know it's going to blow next. So no, it's not a case that Russia was supposed to intervene and didn't. It simply was not obligated to do so. Instead, appears to have chosen this role as some sort of a go-between and try to work a deal. And the evidence of the last couple of weeks is that appears to have worked. And I guess you could say that has gained brownie points with the Trump administration, and it's gained brownie points within.
So what you describe is more or less a pragmatic relationship. And
Yes.
I actually see within the BRICS or the G20 that a lot of countries are taking, there's a whole spectrum. I mean, you got Xi Jinping and Putin at the end that want a geopolitical rival / military rival to the West. And then you got people at the other end of the spectrum, like Modi in India, who wants economic promotion and cooperation and
Yes.
maintains.
Well, I think, look, ultimately it is about economic rebuilding, because Iran is important for Russia, apart from kind of the political arrangements. It is very important for Russia for two other reasons. One is a significant amount of the supply infrastructure, the infrastructure that's used to bring goods into Russia and out, comes through Iran. The international north-south transport corridor, the rail network that connects St. Petersburg all the way down through Kazakhstan, or some cases by ferry across the Caspian through Turkmenistan into Iran. Currently, the port of Bandar Abbas, which is a deep water Gulf port, and also just across the water from Dubai, that's a major source of supply for Russia, and has been since Western borders were closed. So they don't want that to end. And secondly, Russia, it seems to me that Moscow's long-term plans for rerouting gas, I mean, nobody expects the gas volumes to go back to Europe, perhaps a little bit better than it is today, but nothing like what it was. Russia clearly has its sights on sending gas southwards. I mean, ultimately, India would be the prize. And therefore, using a gas swap with Iran, which has been discussed a lot, either to supply gas for an LNG plant in Oman, or even a direct pipeline down to Mumbai, which is not technically impossible. But Iran is really important. When you look at the map, if you look at Russia wants to go south, Iran is the critical piece on that map. So Russia wants Iran, doesn't want Iran to be a country where it simply cannot deal with, or it doesn't want it to be destroyed, or it doesn't want it to revert back to some sort of like a no-go territory. Quite the opposite. Russia would very much the JOSPA deal to be put back on for Iran to be rehabilitated, because that's a big part of the long-term Russia recovery story and a big part of the BRICS story as well.
And what role does oil play in this? I mean, the recent spike in prices, the Kremlin are like, hurrah, because, oil back up to $80 and they have a budget problem.
Sure.
And it's suddenly extra cash, although it's not going to last.
No, it's not. But I think that that spike in oil just reminded, I guess, the US and Europe, I guess, even though they haven't said it out loud, but it certainly will have reminded the big consumer countries that there is a risk to supply, and that they really, can't afford to, push Russia out of the market and then lose an Iranian or a Gulf supply or the Straits of Hormuz. It would destroy the global economy. So I think it's more, the threat to the Straits of Hormuz in particular, I think, is one reason why President Trump simply was not interested in talking about a lower price cap at G7 or a tougher enforcement of against the ghost tankers. Wasn't interested because the U.S. wants Russian supply to continue because there is a continuing risk of supply in the Gulf, and it's far from over. The fact that we're relatively quiet today doesn't mean that will not be the case in a month's time. This is a very, very fragile situation, and it could blow at any point. So I think it helps.
The Iranian parliament, was passed or voted to close the Straits of Hormuz. We did a piece, and you could put just one mine in the water, and then shippers would instantly close it down.
That's it. Exactly right. If people talk too much about, it's X kilometers wide and you would need this many ships. Tada, you're absolutely right. It's nothing to do with that. It's the insurance industry or liability risk spikes too high with even one tanker hit. That's it. Your tankers are greatly reduced, if not stopped. So that helps Russia. It means that the U.S., Trump, etc. They're pragmatic. Whatever else you say about the Trump administration, they are business oriented. They're pragmatic. They understand that if you take Russia out and then you have a problem in the Gulf, the global economy is in trouble. So I think it certainly helps Russia. Yes, they've made money. And this is, as I say, going back to what I said earlier, I do believe that one of the pressures that's building inside Russia that could lead to Russia more willing to sit down and talk and maybe make some compromises to reach a peace deal is because there are financial pressures in the budget are growing. We saw at the end of May, the budget deficit was 1.5% of GDP. They cannot afford to fund that for more than 2 years. There simply wouldn't be enough money to do that. Now, that's probably the worst of it, 1.5. There will be an increase in non-oil taxes in the second half of the year as the tax changes kick in and people pay more income tax, etc. on this scale. And in general, that's one of the success stories of the Russian economy is that, there's still far too many people who write about Russia who talk about almost 60% of the budget being dependent on oil and gas, when the reality is it's now about 25% because the economy has grown elsewhere and tax receipts in other parts of the economy have grown so much. So even in that 5-month period where the deficit grew, it's mainly because there was a 20% spike in spending, which the finance ministry say is smoothing out spending. We wait to see, because normally, as you remember, in Russia, there was always this big spending allocation in December. And
they've changed that as a result.
They're changing that, yeah. So you wanted that spike, but there was a 10% increase in non-oil tax receipts in that 5-month period, which the finance ministry expects to grow more in the second half. And the other thing, which is kind of to me is a bit inexplicable, and I'm still scratching my head as to why they have the ruble so strong. I mean, I can understand that a bit from May. The strong ruble makes the country look good. President Xi is coming, the optimism in the May parade, people go on holidays. But, the strong ruble is badly damaging the budget. And the finance ministry is kind of now, as we saw with Spieth, not so much politely shouting, but openly screaming for a much weaker ruble in the second half because of the conversion factor. So today the ruble is 78 against the US dollar. The finance ministry and the economy ministry both said that they would like to see it at 95 average for the second half, which started yesterday.
I should explain to the listeners who don't know about this that the quirk of the Russian budget is that the oil prices in the budget are denominated in dollars, but the revenue is rubles, which means that a weak ruble for the same dollar exports, you get more rubles the weaker the ruble is. And so you actually get more budget money to spend because it's all the spendings in rubles. So the strong, and it also, depresses exports, such as they are. So the strong ruble is actually a problem. Before we leave this topic, the Straits of Hormuz, now there's a ceasefire in place. That whole threat has basically gone off the table, isn't it? Because my impression from Tehran, we have a bureau there for 2 years already, and talking to them, they're saying, look, at the end of the day, Tehran is very pragmatic, and it wants above all else to have sanctions lifted, and was perfectly willing to do a deal. And with the strikes by Israel, it's got to hit back for its own safe face.
Yes.
And it's politically destabilizing to look weak, so it has to be strong. But if, the attack on the American base in Qatar was classic, it was pure theater.
Yes.
Organized, absolute theater. So they did something and they hit the Americans' biggest base headlines. But it was clear to absolutely everybody that was it. There was going to be one strike and it's going to be over. And the irony is that Iran actually wants to come back into the fold, that we're absolutely work with the West if they can get there, but they can't get there. I mean, there's this, how do you see it? I mean, they've just been demonized for too long.
It has been demonized, and of course Trump in particular has been the main kind of protagonist, as it were. When he was president last time, of course, he pulled the U.S. out of the JASPA deal. He had a very strong pro-Israel position, particularly from Trump administration before and now. So difficult to see any sort of a resolution during the Trump administration, frankly. Maybe more likely something where the groundwork can be prepared with the Europeans, within BRICS, say, with other countries in BRICS, and perhaps something then that might make progress under the next U.S. administration. But I think under the Trump administration, that's completely lost cause, and it's more a case of just building the foundations. But you're absolutely right. Iran not only it needs sanctions to start easing. It needs to start re-engaging with the global economy. Otherwise, you are going to have, I think inevitably, you're going to have a resurgence of domestic protests and threats against the government. The country is facing some severe domestic issues. Apart from even economic issues, just climate change has been very severe in Iran. The number of areas where drought is absolutely in the severe category has grown. They're even talking about having to build desalination plants in the Gulf and pipe fresh water several hundred kilometers to areas that now simply haven't had rain for a long time. They've had a shooting match with the Afghans last year over water rights from the Helmand River. And the government is trying to come up with all sorts of novel solutions to persuade people and companies to put solar panels on their roof to reduce energy consumption, which is, considering that they've got the world's third largest gas reserves, is pretty crazy. But so the country is facing a whole range of problems that could lead to major stability problems for the government. And if they can start to ease sanctions and improve Western trade, then that will alleviate some of their problems, but not all of them. But maybe, but my guess at this stage is that they will rely heavily on the BRICS group. Yeah. They will make preparations, but the expectations of any sort of a deal being done under a Trump administration are pretty low.
Let me ask, because this leads into the last topic that I want to cover, but specifically in the Middle East, there's been a lot of changes, and in particular, MBS from Saudi Arabia, the Prince, the Crown Prince, he's been playing an increasingly active role. And one of the ironies of this whole war Putin started was that he went into it saying, we object to the unipolar world, we want a multipolar world. And actually, he's got what he wants. America's hegemony over the rest of the world has been broken and is now breaking into blocks. You've got an Asian bloc, they're all been forced to cooperate more. You've got the Russia-China bloc that's now, living in each other's pocket. And in the Middle East specifically, given all of this that's going on, MBS played an important role in starting the talks between the White House and Iran.
Yes.
He's also, Syria was readmitted to the Arab League, and they seem to be trying to better coordinate sort of mini EU type thing. And you have all these other bodies like Eurasia, Economic Union. I mean, to what extent Iran is being, because again, between Saudi and Iran, they also made up and restarted diplomatic relations. Chinese brokered that deal.
Sure.
To what extent? I mean, you lived in the Middle East for a long time. I mean, all of these changes, all of these rivalries within the Middle East, are they coming to an end? I mean, isn't this going to bring back to the fold?
Yeah, it certainly has been extraordinary. I mean, in the 90s, you would not have bet on where we are today. I mean, the level of hostility, not rivalry, but downright hostility in the 90s between Iran and the Gulf states on the other side of the Gulf was very extreme. You even had threats of military action, etc. You would not have imagined that the situation would have improved even as quickly as it has done, albeit it's been a couple of decades. But I think you're right. There is a sense, perhaps it is incorrect to say that the world is splitting into two groups, the G7 and the Global South. I think you're absolutely right. It's breaking into different groups where countries or groups of countries see that they have some common interest, and are starting to cooperate a lot more to defend their place globally. So you're absolutely right. I think we will see, obviously the US, Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, Southeast Asia as groups, perhaps cooperating more with each other in some areas. But I definitely see these groups. So in other words, a multipolar world, genuinely, not just a dual polar world, but a multipolar world. And I think, yeah, this generation of leaders that we see in the Gulf, and Mohammed bin Salman being the highest profile, but it's the same. We've had a generation change in the United Arab Emirates, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Oman. Across the board, there's been a generational shift from older leaders that kind of, if you like, were there at the start when these countries first almost discovered oil and started to become countries. But this next generation are, if you like, children or grandchildren of the leaders who went to, Oxford or Harvard or wherever it is. They're much more globally aware. They're much more comfortable in the global world, and they know, they understand a lot more about their position and how to work in the world. So I don't see this as temporary. I don't see that, this will revert to US hegemony or to the Chinese will roll over it. I do see a very strong determination within the Gulf to act, to coordinate, and working with Iran is a critical part of that, which is why, there is certainly evidence of cooperation.
Just a question. I'm sorry, I've only
yeah.
I've got a few minutes left. But as a last question, we've got the BRICS summit coming up in Brazil, and actually, I just bumped into Jim O'Neill, who coined this term. We were chatting about this at the EBRD meeting. But it began as a marketing term for Goldman Sachs to sell stocks, and increasingly it's become a political thing. But I think it's still immature. I think the members don't really know what they want to do with it. Is it going to be a geopolitical thing to stand up to the states, or is it just going to be an economic, trade club? But it's certainly taking on more significance. I mean,
it is. It's becoming. I heard an official in Thailand, which is a partner country. They're not yet a member, but they're a partner country. Described BRICS as something that has evolved from a lazy acronym to something with substance. And exactly as you've said, it was a Jim O'Neill coined marketing term, but now the member countries see this as something with significant potential. Now, nobody is saying this is it, or what we've seen so far is all you're going to get. All of the countries that have talked about BRICS, from Russia to Egypt and other countries, they all see this as something that's going to evolve and that will represent their interests. Remember, one of the reasons why BRICS has now gathered momentum and gathered support, it's not just because of kind of economics. It's also a combination of factors. For example, the Indonesians, I think one reason Indonesia did not join the G7 and is more comfortable with the BRICS is they are simply fed up to their back teeth being preached to by the West over their environmental policies. You can't burn the tree, you can't do this, you can't do that. They are sick to death of that. They want some more constructive engagement on areas like environment. So it's not just about economics, but also sanctions against Russia have also helped accelerate BRICS, because what the sanctions against Russia have shown is that if you fall foul of the G7, then you could lose access to technology, you could lose access to critical services, to equipment making, and therefore Russia has had an easy audience saying, look, we need to work together and build up our own oil field services company, our own technology chains. and become more independent from the West, because that leaves you vulnerable. And that story has resonated. There's
What is the clubbing together that's going? I mean, I just came back from Tashkent and I lived there in the 90s. And then, the Uzbeks hated the Kazakhs, and the Kazakhs had all the money, and the Kyrgyz, and suddenly they're all like C5, they're walking around. We had all 5 presidents come here as a group. Screwed up Berlin traffic for like 2 days because it's like massive motorcades. But it's everywhere you look, you see these groups forming. But then the interconnectors between them as well. The Middle East and...
Well, this is it. I mean, certainly Central Asia is a lot more viable now, simply because of the Chinese Belt and Road, the Russian-Indian North-South transport corridor, and the connectors in between. It's now no longer an isolated middle kingdom, as it were. There's still some. I mean, I think right now the C5 is flavor of the month, because there's a kind of an assumption that it can be a source of critical minerals and supply the West. But unfortunately, I think that like you, I spent a lot of time in Central Asia and looking at Central Asia, and you listen to what people in Washington and Europe are saying about their engagement with C5, what they want to do, and then you say, hang on a minute, you're talking about what you want to do. The Chinese and the Russians have already done it. They are late. The West is talking a good story about the C5 cooperation and investment and development, and the number of options available for them when they finally get to do it will be even fewer than there are today, and that's a lot less than it was last.
Across the board, I was just reading von der Leyen from the EU talking about how the EU is going to tie up with ASEAN and do all this amazing trade. But then the Chinese and the Russians have been there for like a decade. Africa, the same. I mean, they started talking about Africa, but Russians 20 years.
Exactly. And also, of course, as a result of, even when we get peace and there will be some reopening, as we all understand, there won't be the same level of investment and trade engagement between Russia and Europe, at least not for a very, very long time. In the meantime, once the Russians, are more comfortable with outward investment, in other words, they don't need the money at home, they'll be going south into Central Asia, their backyard, and then into Africa and elsewhere. So again, the Europeans and the US, I think, are spending far too much time talking about what they'd like to do and what they hope to do and even what they expect to do, and the opportunities won't be there.
Yeah. Chris, very, very nice to talk to you. Very interesting as always.
Yes, great pleasure.
Thank you again. And for those of you watching online, then we'll post this on YouTube, and we'll also put it out on social media. But as ever, great to talk to Chris.
Okay, see you very. Bye-bye.
Ciao.